Hello, everyone, and welcome to another National Geographic Learning Google Hangout. My name is Sean O'Connor, and I'm joining you all from the National Geographic headquarters here in Washington, D.C. And it is a rainy day outside, just hovering just above freezing, so we have a lot of freezing rain coming down as precipitation. And we are joined today by a good friend and National Geographic explorer, Clare Fieseler. So Clare has been joining us the past couple of months from some research stations in the Bahamas and in Belize, and today she's coming to us from the University of Miami's Rosenthal School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, their research center down in Miami. So here we have Clare, and she's joined by Andrew Baker, a marine biologist and coral scientist who is based out of Miami. Hey guys, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Welcome.
Absolutely. So just to set the stage for everyone who's tuning in, we want to hear from you while this Hangout is happening. And the best way to send in questions so that we can address them while we have Clare and Andrew with us is using the National Geographic Learning Twitter address. So send your tweets to @ExploreInside, and we will get to your questions. So just to kick things off, Clare and Andrew, I'm actually going to take a look at a map of the Miami area so we can set the context for where you all are joining us from and where your studies take place.
Great.
So to do that, I'm actually going to share my screen with you all and take a look at a map of, well, a map. I'm very zoomed out right now, so we're looking at Mexico and the southeast United States. And I actually have a couple of areas highlighted with those blue circles. So I have Belize highlighted as well as the Bahamas. So those are the two locations where we did our last Google Hangout. And today we're actually going to go to South Florida to the Miami area. And just as a reminder, this is our National Geographic Mapmaker Interactive. If anyone wants to explore the geography themselves, you can get to this tool online on the National Geographic website. So what I'm going to do is take us down to South Florida. And I'm actually going to pause right here because in this view of the map, you can see a really important feature that I want to just speak about, and that is the Florida Keys. So maybe you've heard of those before, maybe you haven't, but here on the map, I can see the Florida Keys extending down from Key West all the way up to Miami. And the Florida Keys is a really special place. It's actually an ancient coral reef that is now exposed. So that's where Key West is and a bunch of other populated areas. And then in the underwater areas surrounding the exposed land, there are new coral reef ecosystems that are thriving, but that also face various threats that scientists like Andrew is studying. So the Florida Key system runs all the way up to Miami. And if we zoom in here, we can start to see the city of Miami. And I can actually flip over and look at a different base map, which is a satellite view of the world. And this is a really neat base map because you can see what the land looks like. You can see buildings if we zoom in farther. You can also see these the marine ecosystems, and notice that there's a really dark coloration over on the right side of our map to the east, and a much lighter coloration over on the left of blue. And that's because it's a bit of a more shallow water ecosystem where there are a lot of coral reefs that Andrew is studying. Another thing to notice is that these coral reef ecosystems are located by the city of Miami and some of its neighboring cities. It's a very dense and populated place. In fact, if you zoom in here, you can actually sort of see some of the skyscrapers and the taller buildings of Miami. And here you can actually see the Port of Miami. I'll just kind of highlight a piece of it here. The Port of Miami is a really important place for cruise ships that take passengers out from Miami to locations throughout the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. And it's also an important port for goods that come in and out of the Miami area. And where Clare and Andrew are located right now is on this island, which is just sort of southeast of the city. And I've dropped in a little pin here to mark where the research station is, where they're located. And we can actually zoom in here and see the dock and some of the facilities where they are. And if I zoom a little back farther out, I've also dropped some pins on some of the coral systems that Andrew is going to tell us about. So Claire, I would love for you to just share with our viewers a little bit more about who you are and maybe introduce Andrew a little bit deeper and talk about the work that you guys are both up to.
Sure. All right, so can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Great. Well, we're here down at RASMUS, which is the Rosenthal Marine and Atmospheric Science.
The Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science.
There we go.
Got it.
School of the University of Miami.
Right. If you've tuned into some of our other Google Hangouts, you'll know that I study coral reefs. I'm a National Geographic Young Explorer and current Geographic grantee. And I study the impacts of the warming ocean, so climate change, and the way it's impacting our coral reefs. And I use a lot of methods that use cameras and different experiments. And Andrew's a colleague of mine, and he looks at similar questions related to how these coral reefs are going to thrive or cope under climate change. But Andrew uses a completely different toolbox than I do. One that's very much more geared towards looking at the DNA inside some of these corals and some of the algae that live with these corals in a symbiotic relationship. And so Andrew Baker, Dr. Andrew Baker, he's a professor here at the University of Miami, and he's going to give us a tour actually first, before we even learn about his research, about this brand new facility that's super high-tech, and it's actually a green building, right? And it just opened a couple months ago.
Right. So we're actually standing right now in the lobby, the atrium of this new building, which is the Marine Life Science Seawater Technology Building. And it opened, as Claire said, just a couple of months ago. And a real feature of this building is that the first third of it is actually a giant wave tank. It's an air-sea interaction tank. And we're going to go through these doors and enter that lobby where you can actually see the tank in its entirety. The rest of the building is taken up with running seawater labs where we can do experiments on corals, on fish, on all kinds of marine organisms that we can collect right here in the reefs of South Florida and elsewhere. And as you just saw, as Sean was talking about, we're on the northern end of the Florida Keys Reef Tract, which is actually the largest contiguous reef tract in the continental US. So it's really a great location if you want to study coral reefs, because we literally have them in our backyard. And as you can see there on some of the little coral icons, the study sites that we work on are really close to where we are right now. So that makes it really easy to go out, collect corals or other organisms, bring them back into the labs and study them. So that's what we take advantage of, and that's really what this building is designed to do. So if you want, we can go through these doors and see them. Do
you want to put us on the big screen, Sean? Is that possible?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, there we go.
So right now we're walking into the lobby of the new building, and behind us is this gigantic wave tank. It's the only one of its kind in the US, and it allows us to, scientists here at Rosenstiel, to create hurricane force winds through this gigantic fan which runs at the back of the building and pipes these high force winds all the way through the back and then across this wave tank, which you can see here is essentially kind of like a large swimming pool made out of glass. The sides and the bottom are all made of glass, and so as the winds produce waves across this wave tank, scientists can study the energy that's stored in these waves and can put models of buildings and study the impacts of storm surge and hurricane force winds on buildings and on coastlines.
And this is one of the largest in the country, right?
This is, I think, the largest one in the country, and certainly it's sort of unique in the country for this kind of a facility. And this is really important for folks who live down here in South Florida, where we are sort of every hurricane season we're under threat of potential storms that come our way, and thinking about how we develop coastlines in South Florida, how we build and how we prepare for the future of the next century of presumably increasing sea levels and more powerful storms, this is really a useful facility to help us prepare for that.
And when you're up close and personal, it's hard to get a sense of how big it is. Maybe if you want to step back a little bit, Andrew, it's really enormous.
Wow.
It takes up a good 1/3 of this entire building. So it's really impressive what they can do here, what some of the scientists are doing. So
it's really like a swimming pool. So I'm sure I'm not alone in wanting to be in the tank when they're actually firing the winds across it and trying to swim through these waves. But I'm sure that's not going to be.
And the lasers too. They shoot lasers through. Right?
Yeah, they're studying the velocities, the speed of the water through the tank. So yeah, they use a variety of different techniques. So that was what the first third of this building was designed for. And as I said, it's a brand new building, and we're still sort of in the process of moving in. And so as we walk this way, we're walking down to my labs where we study coral reefs. And down here, we have the ability to work on corals using running seawater. So we can run experiments on our corals, but then we can take the results of those experiments and run them literally right across the corridor, bring the samples to the lab, and in the lab we extract, purify, and analyze the DNA of these organisms, the genetic material, so that we can study how these organisms are responding to the stresses that we're using the experiment for, usually climate change related stressors, so warming temperatures.
And the water is coming right out from the ocean, right?
That's right. Everything that you see in a minute is running seawater. So the seawater comes from a body of water next to us called Bear Cup, which is very close to the Port of Miami. The water passes through a settlement tank, and a lot of the sort of sediment settles out of it over the time that it spends in that tank. And then it gets pumped up to the top of this building, and then gravity helps it come down and feed all of the various labs and all of the various tanks that are in this building. So it's really a huge advantage. We're really one of the few places in this country that has running seawater in this quantity to allow us to deal with corals, which are tropical organisms, really found only in this part of the world as far as the continental U.S. is concerned, and they need warm water, and so here the water's coming in already warm, and so it makes it much, much easier to do these kinds of experiments.
Well, let's see what it looks like with corals. So, Andrew, something that took up a lot of your time this past summer, in addition to the research you do, is that you had a unique opportunity to go and collect corals.
Oh, hey, Claire. We lost you just a little bit, so you might want to repeat that question again when we have you back that you were asking Andrew. And wow, so it sounds like we're going inside of the wet lab where a lot of the experiments happen with corals that Andrew oversees. So, all right, I think we've got you back with us here.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
I think we might be walking a little too fast. You can hear us now, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Andrew was just beginning to describe this past summer. He had a unique opportunity, which not many scientists get, to actually go and collect corals that might otherwise be destroyed by dredging, which is the process in which you make the ocean deeper to make way for the big ships that Sean talked about earlier. And so otherwise, sadly, these corals would have been destroyed, and Andrew and his team took up a huge 10-day effort to rescue most of them, or many of them, about 10% of them. And so he has this really unique collection of corals of different sizes and different species that has been under his care ever since, which presents all different sorts of opportunities for research questions.
She lost connectivity. I'm monitoring you. You're dead here. Try to go inside.
Yeah.
No, we're okay.
You're okay?
Yeah, we're okay.
Oh, okay, great. So do you want to reflect on that at all?
Yeah, so Sean just showed a map showing the Port of Miami, and you can see that we're pretty close by the Port of Miami. It's a very active port, certainly one of the busiest ports in this part of the southeastern United States. But because there's always demand for bigger and larger ships coming into these ports, and because the Panama Canal recently expanded, there is an effort to deepen and widen a lot of the channels that go into these ports really throughout the eastern seaboard of the U.S. And so Miami is one of the ports which is trying to attract this new ship traffic, and in order to do that they need to dredge the channel, in other words make it deeper and wider to allow these large ships to come in. That's all very well and good, but the problem of course is that we're living in South Florida, which is a pretty good environment for corals in general, and in this channel are many corals, and in order for the dredge operation to go forward, we needed to rescue as many of these corals, remove them, and use them for experiments or use them for science and research, as well as for replanting these corals off on the reefs. And so many of these corals were transported to nearby reefs, but the remainder came, or at least some portion of the remainder came back to our labs for research.
And as Sean was able to show on the map, this is a site that's really close to downtown Miami. I think we actually have a photo of the research vessel that Andrew and his team were using for the actual coral rescue. Do we have a photo of that where you can actually see how close this is to the port of Miami?
Great, yeah, we've got the photo up, and we'll put it on the big screen here. And yeah, you can see the skyscrapers of Miami in the background there, it looks like.
Yeah, so this is many people probably are really surprised to learn that there are, corals living in the port of Miami. Certainly, I think lots of people living in Miami were surprised to find these corals on their back doorstep, in their backyards. And it really goes to show that nature can be pretty surprising, that these corals are managing to live in a pretty disturbed environment. There's all these ships going through. There's a certain level of kind of natural turbidity. This is an area where corals are really kind of on the edge. Corals in an extreme environment, and yet these corals seem to be managing to survive in this area that really you'd be surprised to find corals living.
Got it. And a question for you guys. So a question came in from a viewer, and they said, how do you rescue them? So I think when you're out dredging, there's some curiosity to, what do you do? And I know we maybe even have a video to show, and you can also tell us about it.
Yeah. So basically we had a very narrow window to collect these corals. We had about 12 days over the summer where we had permission to go in and dive in an active port area to go down. We used scuba diving to go down and collect these corals, and we coordinate a sort of a crack team, emergency team of volunteers who came down with us, up to about 12 divers, I think, at a total.
And I think we've got a video, too, if you want to play that there.
Yeah.
So what it actually takes.
So this is actually one of the leads for the dive team. This is our dive safety officer, Rick Gomez, and you can see that he's basically, using a hammer and a chisel to take off these corals which are living on the seafloor, and you can see there's a fair amount of sediment around there, and that's what we're trying to rescue the corals from. So these corals come up, using a hammer and chisel, we put them into baskets, and then we bring them up to the surface, where we can then either plant them back out on reefs or bring them back into our facilities here in order to use them for research, for education, and other uses.
But what's unique about this opportunity is often when scientists collect corals, it's very, you're collecting a certain species of a specific size, but this was unique because they were collecting as many as they could possibly collect, right?
So corals, are pretty fragile organisms and becoming increasingly rare and endangered. And usually as coral biologists, when we get permission to collect corals or work with corals, we have to be really careful about how we collect these corals. We usually allow to take only tiny samples of tissue that we use for DNA analyses of their genetic material. And the agencies that are responsible for protecting the reefs of South Florida make it very clear that we need to minimize our impacts on these reefs for good reason. What was interesting about this past summer is that for once, all of those restrictions were removed because all of these corals were going to die anyway as a result of the dredging activities, and so we had a limited time frame to collect as many as we could.
Yeah, I think we got some photos right here too, just to show the diversity of the size and the species that Andrew now has under his care.
So we were literally jumping in, and any coral that we could find within this designated area, we were bringing to the surface, and it really was a coral rescue project, because unless we take these corals, they're going to die either as a result of the dredging or as a result of the sediment. So it was really an unusual opportunity, and I can't impress enough that these corals are pretty fragile. And here's a photo of the corals after we've brought them back to our outdoor tanks over here on Virginia Key, and you can see that they come in a variety of sizes, colors, and species. And I think the thing to point out here is that some of those colonies that you can see in that photo, the larger ones, can be as much as 20 or 30 years old. And so rescuing these corals is really important because, unless we rescue them, it's going to take 20 or 30 years for these corals to come back again. And these corals are so important for the reefs of South Florida because they are sort of the critical habitat builders. They're the organisms that actually build the reefs that Sean talked about right at the beginning of the show.
And when Andrew showed me all the corals they had collected, over 1,000, 1,200, it's really impressive, but it's also a huge undertaking. And that's something, stress. It's really important that we try to, support science, support endeavors that, might be a little bit more unique or opportunistic. But it's a huge endeavor. It's a great opportunity, but it's a huge endeavor to take care of them. You got to make sure that the temperature is right and that the tanks are clean. And so maybe we can also go around the lab, just talk about what it's like to care for these animals in a lab setting.
Sure. So we have a few of our corals here that came from the port, and it's sort of in various different stages of recovery or experimentation. And so in this tank, I'm not sure if you can see down here, so all reef-building corals need sunlight. They need sunlight because corals are animals. In case that's not obvious, a lot of people think of corals as sitting on the seafloor, and they think of them as being just rocks, maybe, or perhaps plants. A lot of them sort of look like plants. They can have kind of a branching tree-like shape, but they are in fact animals. And what's really interesting, and what got me excited about corals when I was a student, is the fact that even though they're animals, they have a really unusual characteristic, and that unusual characteristic is that they form what's called a symbiosis, which is a partnership between the coral animal, which you can see here, and these tiny single-celled algae, plants if you like, that are photosynthesizing and using sunlight energy to make food. And the food that they make is given to the coral polyps, which you can see all the coral polyps here, as kind of a supplement to their food, to their diet. So corals...
So they're both benefiting, right?
They're both benefiting, and so this is what's called a mutualism, or mutualistic symbiosis. And the key here is that corals really can't survive without these symbiotic or partner algae. And these partner algae are partly responsible for giving the coral its color. So you can see this coral has a kind of a brownish coloration.
So what happens when they lose the symbionts? What do they look like?
Yeah, so what happens is when corals get stressed, and stresses can be all kinds of different things, but a common stressor these days is high temperatures. Because of global climate change, the oceans are getting warmer, and corals are seeing more and more episodes of heat stress. And when corals get stressed, this delicate partnership between the coral animal and its algae breaks down, and the coral expels the algae in a sort of a stream of mucus from its mouth, and it turns white. And this process is called coral bleaching. And here you can see a bleached coral. This is a coral that's still alive, but it's now lost its partner algae, and it's white, or mainly white. So these coral animals that are actually living inside each one of these little depressions in the coral surface, each one of the little dimples that you can see, kind of like a golf ball, each one of those dimples contains a coral animal. Those animals have now lost their algae, and they're kind of in critical mode. They need to get those algae back again, and unless they can recover their algae, this coral is actually going to die. And
hey, Andrew, we had a couple of questions that they wanted us to answer from the audience.
Yep.
As we keep these corals in the lab and we're looking at these questions of symbiotic relationship and bleaching, how do you just keep them? What do you feed them? Is a question that came in.
So that's really interesting. So as I mentioned, corals use sunlight energy, and so we use these artificial lights to give them lots of light that they can use to make food. The algae in the coral can use that to make food to give to the coral animal. But the coral, like any animal, also needs to feed on regular food. And actually over here, we have a graduate student, Reva, who is in the process of cleaning and feeding corals. And so if you can get in there, but she's using a squirt bottle containing a kind of a mixture of different coral food types, and she's squirting that mixture of food onto the coral surfaces, and I doubt you'll be able to see it in the shot you've got there. You need to get quite close up, and I don't think that computer's waterproof, but the coral actually has tentacles, and the tentacles come out and grab those food particles and pass it to the coral's mouth. And so this is a way of supplementing their diets, and what we're doing here is trying to help these corals, which are bleached, recover by giving them beneficial food benefit.
Got it. So I'm curious, one of those looked like they were almost maybe the size of a quarter or something, the pieces of coral that your colleague is feeding. Are there like lots of sort of coral animal organisms right on one of those pieces?
Yeah, so each one of those quarter-sized cores is actually something that Reva has produced by drilling the larger coral colony, because she's holding one up there. So she starts with a colony that looks like this, except this is a bleached one, but she starts with a large colony. The Shen uses a drill to take cores about this size from this colony, and we can get maybe 20 or 25 cores like this from this coral colony. And then she can now use those tiny cores, or quarter-sized cores, in her experiment. And this is a way that we as scientists can help control for the individual differences of coral colonies. We can use parts of one colony in lots of things that we challenge it with.
Do you think maybe we should go into the dry lab to talk about some of the ways that we're looking at these differences from a genetic perspective?
Sure.
Thanks.
So just one last thing here is this tank is a tank where this is kind of like an emergency room for the corals. This is a triage chamber. All of these corals are bleached, and we are helping them recover by, as Reva's doing here, feeding them extra food and making sure the light conditions are just right. But healthy corals, which you can see below this tank, they actually have, you can see, a much richer pigmentation. All of these corals are sort of much more healthily pigmented. And I should point out that all of these corals that are in here are corals that we rescued from the port of Miami, which would otherwise be dead at this point. So it's really a bonus that we're able to keep these animals alive and also use them for experiments, which means that we don't need to go out onto reefs and collect corals from reefs to do these experiments on. So it's actually a kind of a win-win. Even though these corals have been evicted from their homes, we like to think that at least they have some sort of life, future life left here.
A question while we're here at the wet lab still. This came in from the...
Hold this, I'll go get my charger.
So Andrew, a question came in from a third grade classroom, and they're in Monterey, California.
Yep.
And they were just curious about corals and wondering, since they're animals, do they have eyes?
That's a great question. So corals don't have eyes per se, but they do detect light. And so they know the difference between day and night, for example, and they can tell when something is close by that might eat them, for example. They can sense vibrations and movement in the water, and that might cause them to pull their polyps in and protect themselves. So they have what we might call very primitive eyes. They do have a way of sensing light, but not really what we would think of as being eyes. But they do have special kinds of pigments in them that function a bit like eyes and allow them to tell the difference between light and dark, and probably also even allow them to tell the difference between lunar cycles, the phase of the moon. And this is important because corals, like any animal, have to reproduce, and they do this in concert with the lunar phase. If it's a full moon or a new moon, they time their reproduction so that it goes at the right time of year when conditions are suitable for the coral babies to have a chance at surviving.
Wow, thank you.
Sean, I know there's a stream of questions. Should we answer a couple now before going into the genetics lab, or?
Yeah, especially there are some, just so I think people are really curious to learn more about the corals. And I've got to admit, I think growing up without having spent too much time learning about corals, I always thought of them as non-living organisms. They look like rocks in the water, and it's neat to learn what a living organism it is. It's a plant, and it has that, I think you called a symbiotic relationship, or sorry, it's an animal with that relationship with a plant. And a question that came in from Montana is about coral, and do they all have tentacles? Do all coral have tentacles?
Yes, they do. So all corals have tentacles, and they all use them for two functions, really. One, to eat and gather food particles, as we just saw Reva feeding them, but they also use them for defense. And in fact, one of the interesting properties of corals is that they all have stinging cells on their body surfaces. And in fact, corals are very closely related to jellyfish. Jellies, anemones, and corals all form a group called the cnidarians. And that group is distinguished by the fact that they all have these stinging cells which they use for defense. So if, for example, some predator comes close to the coral and wants to eat it, it may be stung by these tiny microscopic stinging cells, and also the coral uses those stinging cells to actually sting its food to death before it pulls it into its mouth. So that the tentacle kind of gloms on, grabs its food particle, then the stinging cells get to work and kill it, kind of like a spider in its web. It wraps the, gets the fly, injects it with poison, and then brings it, starts to digest it. But it's the same with the coral. The coral uses its stinging cells to kind of immobilize and kill the food particle before bringing it to its mouth. So actually, corals are pretty savage predators on some level. If you're just the right size, you probably live in fear of getting trapped in a coral's web of stinging cells.
And one of the interesting things about corals you might not notice right away, but it becomes really clear when you go up and look at them up close, is that they come in all shapes and sizes. And just an example of some of the species that Andrew and his team have here is that one of the species that he first held up has really big tentacles, and you can see them clear as day. But then the species that were on the lower section, the darker ones, that's a species called Siderastociderea, and their tentacles are so small it's very hard to even see them with the naked eye. And so it really depends on what the coral uses those tentacles for, whether it's more important to eat or to defend. There's a lot of diversity in the corals which people tend to overlook because at first glance they look a little bit more like rocks than animals.
Yeah, what I think of it as, and especially for some of our younger learners and students out there, when you go out on a hike in the forest, you see lots of different species of birds, and they have different kinds of beaks that help them eat different kinds of food. And it sounds like the same thing is true of corals, with different species have different kinds of tentacles to maybe eat different kinds of food and do other things.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So different corals probably specialize on different kinds of prey items. Corals that have very large tentacles tend to be focusing on larger food particles, because that's the ones that fill out the tentacles. And corals with smaller tentacles focus on the little guys that maybe escape the larger polyp guys, the larger polyp corals.
Got it.
I just saw that there's an interesting question there that someone asked about how long do corals live, and that's actually a really interesting question too, because in theory you can almost think of corals as being immortal. So corals grow as colonies of polyps.
Meaning that they live forever.
Meaning that they live forever. So each one of those coral colonies, as we just saw, has many different coral polyps in it. And the interesting thing about coral polyps is that each one in the colony is genetically identical to the polyp next to it. And so if you think of this coral colony as, imagine it's like an apartment block where different animals, different coral polyps are living in each one of the different apartments. Now imagine an apartment block that is inhabited, lived in, by just identical twins. Every single person in every single apartment is genetically identical to its neighbor. That's kind of what a coral colony is. It's a colony of genetically identical polyps, and these polyps can grow and bud off and reproduce to make more and more polyps. So even though an individual coral colony might typically live for just a decade or a few decades, typically these polyps, in theory, can keep on budding off and reproducing again and again and again, and the coral genetic individual could essentially live forever. Whether that really happens or not is kind of a matter of scientific debate.
Well, speaking about genetic similarities, maybe that's a good segue to go into the genetics lab.
Sure.
Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay.
So we are going out of the wet lab and down the corridor to the genetics lab. And this building, which we talked about at the start of the interview, is kind of unique because the internal part of the building has running seawater through it. So there's kind of a central core of this building has flowing seawater. But then around it are all the labs which we call dry labs. They're dry because they don't have running seawater in them. And we use these for the more clean work that we need to do, typically involving genetics and DNA. And so what we're going to do now is walk into my genetics lab, where we're going to see a little bit about what happens next when we study these corals, and kind of get an impression of what the other side of the research is, which is the genetics side.
So Andrew, when you're talking about genetics, you're talking about the DNA that lives within the corals, but also within the symbionts, right?
Yeah, so DNA is something that all living organisms have. We have them, corals have them, and the symbiotic algae that live inside the corals have it. and it's the instructions, the recipe for making that organism, and it's one of the most important molecules on the planet. It's the molecule that essentially defines life, at least on this planet. And so we study this DNA as a way of understanding how different organisms are able to respond to changes in their environment, especially climate change, and how different organisms meet the challenge of surviving in these environments in different ways.
So it's kind of like a code within the coral or the symbionts that gives a sense of how to predict how well they'll do in the future, right?
Yeah, and one of the main questions that we ask in this lab is, I mentioned at the start that corals are symbioses or partnerships between the coral animal and these algae. It turns out we've figured out using genetics over the last couple of decades that the algae that live inside corals are very diverse. What I mean by that is there's many, many different types of algae, dozens of different types of algae. And these different algae give the corals different properties. So some algae actually allow the corals to survive bleaching, survive heat stress, and some algae tend to be more susceptible to heat stress.
So if you're a coral and you're going to be living in a warmer and warmer environment, you want a specific type of algae that's going to help you survive that, right?
Right.
You want to be able to choose and select for that.
Right, and so one of the things that we use this genetics lab for is to identify the types of algae, symbiotic algae, partner algae, that are found inside the corals. And I think more interestingly, from my point of view, is to figure out whether corals can actually change their algae. Can a coral change from one type of alga to another type of alga and use that as a way of dealing with changes in its environment?
Well, let's see how you do that a little bit, okay?
Sure. And so one of the sort of standard methods in genetic analyses is something called the PCR reaction, or the polymerase chain reaction. And I won't go into the details about that. You guys will hear all about that in high school. But what the polymerase chain reaction does is it makes millions and millions of copies of small fragments of the DNA. And it allows us to study those fragments in great detail.
All right. So let's see what this looks like.
What we have in here is we walk into a dark room, and I'll just switch the light on.
Sean, can you hear us?
Yeah, we can hear you guys.
I'm just going to switch the light on so we can do some introductions and see what's going on in here. So this is a dark room where we visualize the DNA, and here we have a couple of students in my lab who are in the process. They've just finished a PCR reaction, and so they've made millions of copies of DNA, and they've run this DNA out on a gel. And what's going to happen now, come over here, so the DNA is in the gel, and we're going to try and figure out whether the DNA is in there and whether the reaction worked. And so to do that, we're going to put this gel on a light box, and hopefully, if the reaction worked, the DNA is going to fluoresce, it's going to light up, and it'll be sort of an orange color. So let's see if it works. Cross your fingers. So. We're going to switch the light on, and if the reaction works, there we go. So this is a nice looking gel. So what we have here is each one of these lanes, we call them, it contains a single DNA sample, and this bright band in the middle shows us a particular fragment of DNA, and we can see that in fact every single one of these samples worked. Each one has a single bright band. This sort of fuzzier band at the end, it just is some of the ingredients that we used in the reaction. And then you probably see that on each side of this gel, there's an unusual looking lane where there's lots and lots and lots of different fluorescent bands. We call that a ladder, and it's actually a size standard. It allows us to say how big or small the DNA fragment is that we made, that we amplified, that we made many, many copies of. So there you just saw genetics at work, and this is a method that many scientists use, sort of a standard method to study DNA. And in fact, it was a Nobel Prize-winning method. In fact, this polymerase chain reaction won the Nobel Prize 20, 30 years ago.
What do you?
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Eddie.
Wow, thanks. So this is so neat because I think you've just got everyone that is tuning in so interested in these animals, corals, because I have tons of questions just coming in about corals and what they eat and what eats them and what the threats are to them. So I know we actually, when we were in the wet lab, we talked a little bit about what coral eats. But a question came in, and they were wondering what type of fish or other marine life eats corals. Does anything eat coral?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of organisms that eat coral. One example would be there's a certain kind of sea star, a starfish, called the crown of thorns starfish. It can be quite large, about the size of a dinner plate, and it has many arms. These arms are covered with spines, which gives it the name, crown of thorns. And in fact, this starfish is so good at killing and eating corals that in fact some reefs in the Pacific, like the Great Barrier Reef, have periodically been devastated by outbreaks of these coral-eating sea stars that have caused huge amounts of coral loss in those reefs over time. And so, yes, lots of different animals and certain types of fish can eat coral. So there are predators of coral, and they can have sometimes very big impacts on reefs, like the crown of thorns starfish in Australia.
Got it. And I want to give a shout out to Arrowhead High School in Wisconsin who sent in that question. Thanks,
Great
guys.
question.
Did we want to get one thing we didn't mention is that we're here in Florida, but the DNA that we were just able to visualize actually came from the Galapagos, which is in Ecuador in South America. Do we have a photo of that we want to show? And I mentioned that because while it's important to talk about Andrew's work here on the South Florida reefs, his work really is global. And that's important because the thing about climate change, which is so worrisome, is that it impacts every place on the planet. And so here's a quick video of the reefs.
So yeah, as Claire was just saying, the samples that we just saw on the DNA gel actually came from the Galapagos, and this is a movie that I took of a turtle in the Galapagos actually, and I should say that when we are down sampling these corals, we take, as I mentioned before, just tiny little samples that we can bring back to do the genetic analyses. And this was just a video that I was busy down taking my coral samples, and this sea turtle was right next to me and had no qualms about getting close. And the interesting thing about this sea turtle, which I thought, was that it's actually eating, I don't know if you can see there, but there's a green alga, a green seaweed that is covering the coral reef there. And it turns out that that seaweed is actually invasive. It's not from the Galapagos, and it's causing problems in the Galapagos because it's overgrowing the reefs. And I thought it's interesting that this sea turtle is actually eating that algae, which is called Caulerpa. And that could be a good sign that maybe there's a natural herbivore which can eat this algae and control its spread. So this was kind of a fun discovery that I made just as I was busy collecting my samples.
Because with climate change, obviously, there's a lot of threats, but there are a lot of different processes on the reefs that are going on, like the herbivory, the turtles eating seaweed that we want to maintain on our reefs in South Florida and globally, because that will act to mitigate or to offset the effects of climate change.
Well, and it also sounds like the corals really make up an important base for everything else. Like there are lots of fish, there are turtles that depend on the corals for their health. Is that right?
Yeah, so the one thing we haven't mentioned is just why corals are important. And from a biologist point of view, corals are important because coral reefs are the marine equivalent of rainforests. Everybody, I think, knows that rainforests are homes to millions of different organisms, and they're some of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. Biodiverse meaning that there's lots and lots of different species living in them. Well, it turns out that coral reef ecosystems are the sea's equivalent of that. And more species live on coral reefs than in any other ecosystem in the ocean. And yet these coral reef ecosystems are pretty rare. They only cover about 0.1% of the world's surface area. And yet by some estimates, they are home to 10 million species or more. Somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all marine fish species depend on coral reef ecosystems for some part of their life cycle. And so if you think of these coral systems as being marine rainforests, then just as you can't imagine a rainforest without any trees, you can't imagine a coral reef without any corals. They're what we call the ecosystem engineers. They're the organisms that build the habitat, and build the structures that all of those other organisms depend on.
And Andrew actually brings up a great point about just the diversity on this reef. I mean, there's so much diversity. Much of that diversity we still don't know about. There's a question I see here that is there any use for coral in society, like it might have medicinal properties or something? There actually is a lot of innovation going on right now with some different poisons found with naturally occurring poisons within different organisms on reefs that are used for antibiotics. Like Andrew said, there's just so much diversity that these corals support, and without these corals, that diversity would not be there. And we're only just starting to explore the possibilities for our own benefit society, but also the possibilities of the benefits to the larger ecosystem now. So there's still a lot to explore,
Yeah.
but it really comes down to that these corals form the foundation of that ecosystem, like trees are the foundation for the forest ecosystem.
And so even though coral reef ecosystems are really biodiverse, as biologists we're into that, coral reef ecosystems also provide lots of kind of important values for coastal societies. So here in South Florida, for example, and in other parts of the world, a healthy coral reef offshore can actually serve as a wave break. It can actually help protect coastlines from the effects of violent storms and hurricanes. And so if we can maintain healthy coral reefs, it can actually help us protect our coastlines from storms. And in other parts of the world, coral reefs are actually critical ecosystems for coastal livelihoods and coastal communities of humans that live there. Just here in South Florida, the healthy coral reefs are worth about $6 billion to the local economy every year. And in other parts of the world, they're even more important. They're really critical to the livelihoods of humans that live there. They're the main source of their animal protein, and they form, the backbone of these societies. So here in the United States, we tend to think of coral reef ecosystems as a luxury ecosystem, somewhere where we could go for recreation and diving and fun. But actually, in other parts of the world, East Africa, Indonesia, the Philippines, coral reefs are really an essential ecosystem that support the coastal communities and provide them with food, fisheries, and increasingly tourism opportunities that allow them to sustain these economies.
Right, that's something people don't give much credit to coral reefs. Much more than just a pretty place to dive. Sean, I see a lot of questions coming in here. Should we try to answer some of these?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask one that came in from Danville High School, which is in Kentucky, and I think we've got them hooked at this point on the importance of coral protection. Their question is, what's the most effective way to stop coral depletion or to stop all the harm that's being caused to coral?
That's a great question, and I'm so glad that they asked that question. So coral reefs are really in crisis. We've lost, by most estimates, somewhere between about 50 and 80% of the corals on reefs around the world, just in the last 30 or 40 years, which is amazing that we're actually losing that much, and many people don't know this.
And right here in our own backyard in the Caribbean, which is the ecosystem that these Florida reefs are in, it's probably, these Caribbean reefs are probably more in crisis than any place else in the world. So research right here in this area is really critical to even understanding degradation in other places.
So what we need to do is understand why these corals are being lost. And they're really being lost through a variety of different impacts, but some of the most important impacts are global climate change, which is causing increasingly warmer oceans, and these warm oceans heat stress the corals and cause them to bleach, and we just saw some examples of bleached corals in the lab. So bleached corals can recover. They can recover from bleaching and survive, but they can only recover if the conditions return to normal and if all the other factors that might cause a coral to suffer are removed. And so some of those factors include nutrient pollution. If we pollute coastal waters with nutrients through human sewage or from agriculture, that promotes the growth of seaweeds on a reef at the expense of the corals, and so these seaweeds can actually overgrow and smother corals.
Just like those seaweeds that we saw in the video.
Just like the seaweeds that we saw with the turtle was eating in the Galapagos. So we need to make sure that corals live in clean water where nutrients are kept low. And we also need to be aware that a lot of the coral death that's occurred has actually occurred as a result of disease. And these diseases are wiping out corals at an alarming rate. And they often hit during the bleaching phase. In other words, when corals are bleached and they're weakened, they don't have their symbiotic algae, that's when they're most susceptible to these diseases. And it's actually more often the disease that kills the coral versus the actual bleaching itself. And so really it's bleaching and disease that have caused most of the coral loss, but we have to make sure that for the corals to rebound, we have to control nutrient pollution, and we also need to control, importantly, fishing. A lot of fishing occurs on coral reefs, and we can be much smarter, I think, about the types of fish that we fish, when we fish them, and how we regulate those fisheries. And we can do those by creating things called marine reserves or marine protected areas, which is a way of trying to control how humans use these reefs and make sure that we use them in a smart way so that these coral reef ecosystems have the best chance of rebounding from disturbances like climate change.
And there are a lot of marine protected areas that have been set up in order to do just that, right here in South Florida too. But they only account for less than 1% of our coral water, of our coral reefs in the world. So less than 1% won't do much. So there is a really big drive, and to try to promote the willingness to set more up in the world, to establish more protected areas, so that we kind of have a safety net for these corals.
And a great way of thinking about this is if you think on land, we create national parks. And if people go to a national park, people are comfortable with the idea you can't go to the national park and shoot bears or wolves or the large predatory animals that you might see there. They're protected, and we sort of protect nature from our impact. I think people have to sort of maybe undergo kind of a mental shift in how we think of the organisms that live on coral reefs, because some of those organisms are top predators too. Things like grouper and snapper, even though they're beautiful fish and we love to eat them, and sharks, they are top predators in those ecosystems, and they're the marine equivalent of the lions, the tigers, and the bears. And when we go out and fish them, we're removing these top predators from the system, and we're having big impacts on those systems as a result.
Got it. Thank you. A question from Mrs. Shoemaker's science class at Elder Grove Elementary. Is it illegal to take pieces of coral reef?
Yes, absolutely. So in most countries, including the US, coral is protected by law. And here in the United States, in fact, we now have 20 species of corals that are on the endangered species list. Actually, we have 22 species on the endangered species.
Some of those species are in the lab.
Some of those species are in the lab. They include the staghorn and elkhorn corals here in South Florida. And this really reflects the fact that we've lost so many of these corals to these combined stressors. The staghorn corals, and actually I have an example right here. Staghorn corals, and this is the skeleton of a staghorn coral. Staghorn corals used to be some of the most abundant corals in Caribbean coral reef ecosystems. They grow really quickly, and they would often dominate shallow habitats. But we've lost 97% or more of these corals throughout their range. They may be coming back, but back in 2005 they were placed on the endangered species list as threatened because we've lost so many of them, and because if we want these ecosystems to recover, helping these corals recover would really help, because they grow much faster than most other species, and they might actually build the habitat back again and allow us to have those ecosystems.
And one thing I should mention, I mean, these are beautiful pieces, and it's not uncommon, especially in places like Florida and the Caribbean, to see this sometimes in someone's home, because 20, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't know the extent to which we were damaging corals. And so, if you see something like that in someone's home or on display somewhere, we need to, say something that it is illegal, that this is not for, this is not for decoration. These are organisms that are severely threatened. And everyone needs to do their part to make sure that we're not supporting the continued take of these organisms from the environment for jewelry or for decoration. It's just not worth it. They're too valuable at this point, alive, to then use dead on our homes.
Right. Their value really lies in being alive on reefs and continuing to build those ecosystems that we depend on.
Yeah, right. Got it. Thank you, guys. I love this question that came in from a third grade classroom. They asked how they can become the people who get to take care of corals. So what do you think? What would you tell this third grade class?
So, I mean, when I was a third grader, I was really interested in science and was interested in nature and biology. I was the kind of kid that was always turning over rocks in my backyard and poking around in tide pools whenever we went to the beach. And if you're interested in corals and you're interested in protecting them, then I think learning more about them and becoming scientists is a great way of doing that. We need scientists. We need people with science education, and we need our society to be more scientifically educated. But also, in addition to scientists, we need people to be advocates, people who aren't necessarily scientists but have a passion about corals and can work with local governments and work with local communities and tell them about the importance of coral and make sure that they're protected. So actually, coral reefs can't be saved by scientists alone. We need politicians, we need community leaders, and we need the society at large to value them and appreciate them.
And kids too. I mean, kids can do a
too.
lot, writing to their congressmen, writing to local organizations, supporting efforts to stop illegal trade of coral. I mean, writing letters and raising small funds. That's something that all classrooms can do. And so, I'd say that no small action is too small.
That's a great point, Claire, and I just want to stress again that we need you guys, the students tuning in today, to not only do a Claire set and see if you might write letters or raise funding that can go towards protection of corals, but to actually, if you're interested, jump into this science yourself by starting in your own backyards with investigating the kinds of wildlife that live around you, and then hopefully someday maybe going and getting to study at a marine research center, like there in Miami or in many other locations. So we are nearly at our wrap-up time, and let's see if there's any last questions we want to take care of. We had, so this one came in a few times, so I'll ask it. I don't know if we heard it exactly. Do corals have brains?
That's a great question. I wish they had, because they might have some ideas for how we could help save them. But they don't have brains as we think of them. They have neural nets, kind of a network of neurons that allows them to sort of communicate within their own polyp and also across polyps. And so corals that, polyps in the same colony that are connected to one another have a certain amount of communication through this neural network, but it's not really a brain in the sense of that we think about it.
Gotcha.
The interesting thing about a coral is corals are a bit like a lawn of grass. You can actually, just as you can chop a lawn of grass into squares and make squares of turf, which you can then plant out and make a new grassy lawn with, you can do the same thing with corals, and that's what we were doing in the lab. We take coral cores, those little plugs, those little quarter-sized plugs, and they will actually grow and become a whole new colony.
But then it also allows us to do real restoration efforts too.
That's right.
With separating these corals and placing them in places where we could, restore coral cover to more historical coverages, and so to try to counteract some of the degradation we're seeing here in Florida, those wonderful properties of corals allow us to do that.
Right.
Wow, cool, thank you. Well, we have to end our Hangout now. If there are other questions that come in at the Explore Inside Twitter handle, we'll do our best to answer them, and I just want to thank Claire and Andrew for sharing this awesome work with us. I've learned so much about coral organisms today and some of the threats that are facing them. Thank you for sharing it with all of us. It's been exciting and inspiring.
You're most welcome anytime.
Yeah, it was fun.
Okay, we look forward to the next one.
All right, take
Thanks,
care,
Sean.
Sean. Bye-bye.
Bye.